So essentially, this kind of trouble is it's a multi-generational family saga, right? And it follows like this couple, seemingly interracial, right? So we have Benjamin, who is white passing, but who has sort of like some kind of cultural heritage in Nigeria. And then we have Margaret, who sort of like lives with, schizophrenia. But essentially, it sort of like plays around with this with mental illness through a Western lens, but also through the lens of African spirituality, right? And so like rightly mentioned, there are sort of like three parallel timelines happening here, right? So we have the novel's present, which is 2005. We have the 60s, which is really the time or the decade that brought Margaret and Benjamin together. And then we have like the early 1905, the early 20th century, when the small village was sort of like having colonial contact. Now, to give a context, I wish I could take more credit, but remember that I said that I came to fiction as primarily a short story writer and I could only write in the short form, or rather, I thought that if I go in, right, as an inexperienced writer trying to sort of like write this grand sweeping narrative, right, I would just sort of like be overwhelmed by everything, right? So I actually started the novel as a set of short stories, as a set of connected short stories, right? And so my thinking had been, I'm going to write this collection of stories, interlocked or interlinked short stories, right? That is going there, and they're going to speak to each other. Of course, by the fourth or fifth chapter, I kind of knew that this isn't working as short stories. It's sort of like it's a novel. They're more interconnected than I thought, So the first chapter I wrote was Margaret, because that's a character that sort of like was just so strong in my heart, right? She was so strong in my heart because, I've always been interested in just the idea of mental illness, right? I'm drawn to, sort of like the ways that people with, how do I say? I'm just sort of like drawn to. I've tried my best to shy away from. I shy away from diagnostic language, even though I have like a lot of references. So I don't want to use the word psychotic, if you see what I mean, right? But people who sort of like experience some kind of rupture from being lucid, people who are sort of like considered not normal, non-conventional, people who hear voices. Right. And the reason I shy away from diagnostic language is there's a way in which it sort of like closes the door. If I say schizophrenia, then you kind of like just presume you know what I'm talking about, right? So what I've always been interested in mental health, mental illness, right, of the psychotic or psychiatric variety, right? And I've written some short stories in that register, in that realm, that I didn't really feel I was sort of like, so I knew that my first novelistic project, right? That I was going to have to really move. And it's very personal because, it's I was writing from, you know, um, having watched a relationship of someone who is really close to me, live with this, right? So Margaret had always sort of like been a specter that I'd carried in my mind, right? I knew I was going to have like a middle-aged or slightly older woman who, had these sort of like, ruptures from reality. Right. I knew I was going to have that. Right. But the question was, how do I don't want to write. It was important to me that I wasn't writing a novel about schizophrenia and I wasn't writing a novel about mental health because the tendency in literature is to sort of like write about these experiences as a kind of advocacy or as a kind of, social reference or as a kind of, trauma, but I wanted a character who had this experience, who could just exist without sort of like, the interruptions or the interventions, trying to fix I didn't want a character I was trying to fix or trying to psychoanalyze. I wanted to create a character who had this very visceral experiences, right? Moving through the world, right? But who also had a logic for why these things were happening to them, right? Whether or not that logic is plausible or not, I wanted to leave that decision to the reader, but I wanted to sort of like, just create a world where a mentally ill person could just exist and not necessarily where the writer or the narrator is trying to fix this person. Well, actually, Benjamin was the last character, the third character that came to me, right? So I wrote Margaret, and then I wrote again when I was starting, I thought I was writing a set of interconnected short stories or interlinked short stories. So I wrote Margaret's first chapter. And I wrote it an episode where I wrote like a chapter where she was having an episode. And then the next chapter was the village, one of the village sections, right? And what I wanted to do, I wanted to write a love story, right? I was thinking about, colonial contact, right? I was thinking about the violence, but I wanted to sort of like flip that a bit, right? So I wanted to think about colonial, I wanted to think about colonial violence alongside the idea of colonial relations, right? Because I think that the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? I think that there were a lot of horrible things that happened, but I also think that there were, I'd like to imagine that there was some kind of like, transgressive intimacies, right? And so in the village section, I had like this um villager, this lady who had sort of like followed the Western ways of worship, right? And her people had sort of like rejected her. And there was this young seminary that came into the village and they had like an affair which resulted in a child, right? When I started writing that chapter, I didn't realize he was going to, I don't want to spoil it for readers, but I didn't realize he was going to end the way that he ended, right? And so it was only when I got to the end of that chapter that I realized that, well, the story is actually about his descendant. And that was when Benjamin came to me. I wanted to set it in the 60s because, that's the way the story came to me. But I will say that it was important that if this was all happening in Lagos, right? Just because Lagos had like a longer arc of just being a kind of, African metropolis, right? So Lagos was sort of like a colonial port city, right? So all of these, so if we're thinking about the legacy of colonial contact from the village, right, you can't sort of like escape the fact that Lagos was one of the spaces where sort of like these routes, movements, right? So whether you're thinking trade, export or whatever, it was happening in the ports in Lagos, right? There's also the fact that at the time in the 60s, Lagos was actually the capital of Nigeria. Right. And so many of the Lagos was also sort of like one of the parts of the of Western Nigeria that sort of like had opened up to sort of like colonial changes or colonial partnership at the time, right? And so Lagos really more as just as it is right now, just as it is today, I'm just losing my train of thoughts. Just as it is today, Lagos really is a kind of, metropolis, as it were, right? Not just because of the colonial port, but also because Lagos was so-called termed the land of opportunity, like the place that you came to, right? Because it had like maybe the schools and it had like I mean, all the cities in Nigeria now have the schools, but Lagos was like one of the first or foremost developed spaces. It was the capital, like I said. So a lot of government contracts, a lot of banks, a lot of international partnerships, a lot of businesses, right? And so families essentially, right, migrated from the north, from the east, right? And they also like moved to Lagos, the land of opportunity, right? And so it made sense that even though Benjamin's connection was to a village in the southeast, right? It made sense that he would come to Lagos first, right? And then from Lagos, get like a local guide, right? Because a lot of like if you think about sort of like the airport authority, like most of those routes were sort of like going through Lagos, right? It was all happening in Lagos, right? And so if there was going to be if I was going to sort of like write a Benjamin who had a job or write a Margaret who had a career and who had ambitions, right? It was important that sort of like this was all happening, in a kind of metropolis. It's a critical question, sort of like that I had to grapple with, right? So I have this story that for some reason spans a century, right? There's, it's almost impossible, I think, unless you're writing some major, really large literary, masterpiece, right? But it's really hard to sort of like write a century spanning novel and start from point A through to the end and just follow like a linear track, right? But also time doesn't work like that, right? Now, the one of the novel's thesis or one of the novel's central intrigues is the idea that the past informs the future, or that we think that the past informs the future, or we sort of like think that, the past and the present are constantly immutably entangled, right? And so I wanted to sort of like mimic that sort of like, contact between present and past, right? And so it was important to sort of like write the story as kind of narrative vignettes, right? That starts in the present and then connects it to something in the past, right? And so time is not necessarily linear. It might be difficult for like you would have to be like a very engaged, curious reader to be able to sort of like fit everything together, right? But then the way that we also connect our lives to the past, we don't connect our lives to the past, to childhood experience, just like in a linear, I really wanted the structure of the novel to sort of like mirror the ways that our minds connect, present with past. 2005, it's about 43 years after they met, right? So they came together in the 60s, the things happened and their relationship ruptured, and then they both went their separate ways. Benjamin actually left, right? And so in 2005, we see Margaret, right? She's no longer the 20-something-year-old, naive, in love, passionate young woman, right? She's lived the full arc of her life with her mental health condition, right? She's retired, even though it was sort of like an early retirement. She's actually done pretty well for herself, right? Despite the limitations. She has a daughter, she has a grandson, and she really just wants to have a quiet ending. She doesn't want any trouble. She grapples, even though she's a prideful woman, but she grapples with a lot of shame, right? And so she's moved into this new estate because she's convinced herself that she can go somewhere, she can go spend her retirement years somewhere anonymous, where people sort of won't know her, won't recognize her, won't point fingers, because she's lived with that all her life. Wherever she goes, something happens, she has an episode, and then all of a sudden people know, right? And then she moves to this new estate, and things are fine for the first 10 years until they're not, right? And then we have Benjamin. Benjamin has left the marriage in the 60s. He goes to Ghana because he's trying to find answers. Then he goes back to the UK, and then he leaves, because it's just sort of like he's running away from himself. He doesn't necessarily, he feels like there are perhaps ghosts everywhere, ghost of his father, ghost of his own, errors or mistakes, right? So we find Benjamin in the US, right? He's also at a season of his life where he's retired. They're in their 60s, right? They're in the mid to late 60s. So retired, the question of what comes next. And he's usually at that phase of life where a person, I mean, I'm not in my 60s, but I imagine that it's at that phase of life where a person begins to sort of like settle more into, it's less about ambition and more about relationships, right? And so their lives, their professional lives have quieted in a sense that they can then pay attention to their relationships, or in Benjamin's case, to the failed or ruptured relationships that he left behind.